Grazie professor Andrea Pase, buon pomeriggio a tutte e a tutti. Sono per l'appunto Salvatore Eugenio Pappalardo, ricercatore in geografia post-riforma Gelmini e vice direttore del master di secondo livello in G-Science e sistemi a pilotaggio remoto per la gestione integrata del territorio e risorse naturali. Lavoro attualmente all'Università di Padova presso il Dipartimento di Ingegneria Civile Edile Ambientale. Ci stiamo avviando verso l'ultima, ma non meno importante, sessione del Congresso Geografico. Ritengo doveroso anzitutto ringraziare tutti quelli che hanno reso possibile questo evento, ossia tutti i membri del comitato scientifico e del comitato organizzatore. Un particolare ringraziamento va alla professoressa Marina Bertoncin, responsabile della sezione di geografia del DISGEA e presidente del Congresso Geografico. In prima istanza vorrei dare, siete già collegati, comunque un bentornato in continuità alle e ai partecipanti del Congresso Geografico Italiano 2021 e do anche un caloroso benvenuto a tutti coloro che si stanno collegando in questo momento sul canale YouTube G-Science TV e su Facebook per seguire questa importante sessione plenaria che vorrebbe dare, tramite parole e pensieri del nostro keynote speaker Boaventura De Sousa Santos, che saluto, uno sguardo, o meglio una visione, su un mondo che oggi sempre più e più che mai è in rapida trasformazione e in movimento. Sarà mio compito infatti introdurre e coordinare in lingua inglese la presentazione e il dibattito di questa sessione The Future Can Start Now, 1 year after the cruel pedagogy of virus. Il futuro può partire adesso, un anno dopo la crudele pedagogia del virus. Sarà comunque possibile seguire l'intervento tradotto dagli interpreti, che ringrazio per il lavoro certosino, nel canale in italiano. Per switchare al canale italiano c'è un bottone interpretazione in basso a destra. A seguire l'intervento ci sarà spazio per il dibattito, si possono quindi rivolgere domande al relatore. Chiedo pertanto all'apertura della discussione di scrivere nella chat di Zoom le domande in italiano oppure meglio direttamente in inglese. È possibile anche prenotarsi sempre in chat per prendere direttamente la parola. Quindi da adesso la sessione sarà in lingua inglese. From now the session switches in English. So, good evening everybody. Aquí estamos. Here we are in this special session. I am particularly honored and personally so excited to introduce and to coordinate this last but not least keynote speech of the 33rd Italian Geographic Congress. By this keynote, the intention of the Congress is to give a visionary contribution to scientific and public debate about the global and permanent state of crisis that is shaping our lives in the beginning of this century. A global state of crisis which involves all the spheres of living forms, humans and non-humans, at different geographic and relational scales. A permanent state of crisis that is exacerbated by the pandemic status, which is unveiling and intensifying many unsolved issues related to the capitalistic exploitation, the colonial power and patriarchate, inequalities and injustices, racial and sexual discrimination on one hand, but also dramatic impacts on the ecological systems at a different operational scale, let's say action scale. So from species biodiversity to ecosystems to the whole biosphere, if we think at the tip of the iceberg represented by the climate change, which embodies all the contradiction of economic, productive and development models. As widely documented by the latest assessment report from the IPCC, as well as from local communities, especially in the Global South, climate change effects, such as meteorological extreme events and changes in climate patterns, are nowadays taking place throughout the world. Perhaps in this critical phase of rapid changes, it is time to take and to understand some lessons from the COVID pandemic, by also rethinking the human-nature relationships, that is a spatial vocation and the heart of all the geographic disciplines, as well as for any geographer. So I won't keep going with words. It is time to introduce one of the most heavy thinkers of the last 40 years, which is working on the issues of economic globalization, colonialism, democracy, human rights, social justice, with a particular attention to the invisibles from the global south. So we have the honor here to have Professor Boaventura De Sousa Santos. Welcome to the 33rd Italian Geographic Congress. Professor De Sousa Santos was founder and thinker of the famous World Social Forum, an important process which rapidly spread worldwide by involving organizations from civil society and movements of more than 100 countries into the so-called alter globalization construction, what was widely known as another possible world. Otro mundo es posible. Professor Boaventura De Sousa Santos is Emeritus Professor of Sociology, University of Coimbra, distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and director of the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. He's author of many publications in different languages on the issues of globalization, sociology of law, epistemology, social movements, and the World Social Forum. Among so many publications, it is important to cite some of them which may represent a milestone for many researchers from different disciplines and for a wider public. So in 2002, towards a new legal common sense, law, globalization, and emancipation. 2006, globalizations, theory, culture, and society. 2014, epistemologies of the South, justice against epistemicide. 2014, O Derecho dos Oprimidos. 2015, If God Were a Human Rights Activist. 2019, Knowledges Born in the Struggle, Constructing the Epistemologies of the Global South. 2020, Toward a New Legal Common Sense, Law, Globalization, and Emancipation. 2021, The Pluriverse of Human Rights, the Diversity of Struggle for Dignity. And last but not least, and also perhaps important for us, 2021, Decolonizing the University, the Challenge of Deep Cognitive Justice. So in April 2020, in times of pandemic, he wrote the famous book in Portuguese, A Cruel Pedagogia do Vírus, The Cruel Pedagogy of Virus, translated and published in many languages and in Italian from the Castelvecchi Editore in June 2020. No more words. I give the floor and the screen to Professor Boaventura De Sousa Santos for a reflection on the future can start now, 1 year after the cruel pedagogy of virus.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Salvador, for the introduction, the kind of you. It's a great pleasure to be here and again in contact with the Italian public and the scholars, in this case, the Congress of Geographers. I'm really pleased because I think that our disciplines in social sciences as a totality are going to be impacted upon by this pandemic. So in fact, the most recent book, in fact, Salvador was almost exhaustive about describing of my books, but the very last one, in fact, is in Italian now, is the Italian translation of a book now is coming out in English, but is already published in Italy, Il futuro comincia ora, published by Castelvecchi. And in this book, I developed some of the arguments and many others about the main argument of that I've been trying to put forward concerning the pandemic. And the basic argument is that I'm convinced that the 21st century begins with this pandemic. Of course, there were candidates. Usually, as you know, Eric Hobsbawm has told us that the centuries never begin on the 1st of January of the first year. Because, for instance, the 19th century began with the Industrial Revolution of 1830. The 20th century began with the First World War and the Russian Revolution. Well, when does this century start? Well, many people thought that it started 20 years ago with 9/11, that tomorrow will be mentioned everywhere in the world, where the fall of the Twin Towers in Berlin, the terrorist in New York, the terrorist attack. Others mention the global meltdown, financial meltdown of 2008. I think they were serious events and very good candidates to be the beginning of this century. But I think that the pandemic has a different characteristics, because I think that the pandemic, now that probably the acute phase is going away in some countries, at least in Europe, we are entering a chronic moment of this pandemic, which is becoming now endemic. And the uncertainty around this is so high that I think that it's going to be an event that is going to change the lives of people in the next decades. It's very difficult to think what does it mean to return to the normality, even if the normal state of affairs is hell for most people in the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and squatter settlements, in poverty and destitution, and so on and so forth. So I think it's going to be a life-changing event, globally speaking, because I think that we are not yet being, free of this pandemic. We are entering a period of recurrent pandemic because, as Salvatore already mentioned, this pandemic is related to the climate change and to all the transformations. I'll say something about that in a minute. So I think it will be very, very important. And in fact, the levels of uncertainty at this point are quite scary for most of us that have been reflecting upon this pandemic. And I would select a few of very disturbing revelations of these individual contradictions of this pandemic. The first one, I would say, is that the contradiction between a sense of fragility, of human fragility, that the pandemic has inscribed in our lives. I mean, the pandemic, the virus came and we didn't know how to react. The governments were not prepared. Even the virologists, which have been studying these things, were taken by surprise. It was such a fragility that all of a sudden, we are almost back in the 16th century in the position of the indigenous peoples of Latin America when they had the first contacts with the colonizers, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and later on the English and the French. They brought with them a virus, but this virus was the smallpox. They were protected against this virus, but the indigenous people were not protected. And because of that, they died by the millions, for instance, in Mexico. So this sense of vulnerability is very high in many parts of the world for many people across the classes. And at the same time, this occurs on the eve of a demonstration of human potentiality, of human master of life and technological life. I'm referring to the fourth industrial revolution, the artificial intelligence, robotics, internet, and among things, all these things are the robotization of work, the automatization of work. All this signals a power, a human power of technology that is really unprecedented. How to combine these two images? On one side, fragility. On the other side, an arrogance of technological domination of nature and of society. I think that we are going to live with this contradiction for a while. And I think it is very important to bear that in mind because it's going to have social, political, and cultural consequences. The second one is that another disturbing revelation is that on one side, the pandemic has shown the failure of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism has been telling us for 40 years that society should be really governed by the rationality of the markets, because the states are inefficient, are corrupt, and should be diminished in their participation in social life. And therefore, if we can privatize health, we should privatize health, privatize education, privatize public services. This has been the message all over the world for the past 40 years. Well, the pandemic came. And in fact, people did not resort to the markets for protection. They resort to the state. And all of a sudden, the state was asked to provide protection to the people. And most states were not ready to do so. In fact, the states had been incapacitated, not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world. They have been incapacitated even in countries with a strong public service, health service, like Portugal, for instance, I think that 10 years ago, our public services, health services were stronger and readier to confront this pandemic than they were now. Because in the meantime, there has been all this pressure to privatize health and to transform health from a public good into a business. And therefore, the states were not there, but states were asked for protection. And in fact, the protection, whatever protection was provided by the public services. So are the states important? Should they remain important, or they are just important in crisis? What kind of public policies should we be engaged in if we from now on think, as I think, that we are entering a period of recurrent pandemics, of what I call intermittent pandemics? We go from one pandemic, we have seen already that the current vaccines are 50% efficient vis-a-vis the current varieties of the virus, and others are coming up because of the nature of our protection, globally speaking. So I think that the contradiction and the disturbing contradiction, and one would expect that neoliberalism is gone, because the pandemic has shown the failure of these policies, as the policies, dominant policies everywhere in the international institutions, etc. But it is not that. We see that the neoliberal ideologies go on being very strong everywhere. For instance, look what's going on now with the vaccines. We know that the world will not be protected. None of us will be protected if the world is not fully vaccinated. So there is a very important global movement called the Global Vaccine Alliance for the dispensing or licensing of intellectual property rights over the patents, so that these vaccines can be produced everywhere at a very low cost, because the differences on cost of a vaccine with patent, without patent, is between 3 euros and 20 euros, around that. So it's a great difference. It makes a huge difference, particularly for the countries outside Europe and North America. Well, in spite of the fact of this pressure to license the patents, which would be the only way to find a safe world very soon, well, there is no sign that the patents are going to be licensed. And therefore, we know that while we in Europe are already thinking about the third doses of the vaccine, the rest of the world has between 1 and 10% of the people vaccinated. So, and if they are not vaccinated, we are not safe, because the world is now globalized. So we go everywhere, and the varieties, the different variations of the virus can come at any moment. And as we have seen with Delta, transform completely the world. So, and now the debate is whether a third doses of the vaccine or another different vaccine. So there is what we call now vaccine capitalism, global vaccine capitalism going on, which is really a good example of neoliberalism in terms of health. And not only that, also the Cold War. There is a geopolitics of vaccines that will be busy being used. I mean, the vaccines are licensed by the World Health Organization and those from Russia, from China, from Cuba. And the embargoes that are still being enforced and implemented, so that, for instance, the Cubans cannot develop the vaccine, even though they have all the technology ready, but they need a basic product to produce them. That is to say, neoliberalism in the end is very well alive after this pandemic, which is really disturbing for us to understand what's going on in the next few decades. The third disturbing contradiction of this pandemic now, almost 2 years, 1 year and a half after I finished the first book on this, is that many authors, and a very prominent author in Italy, wrote very early on that this was the road to a state of exception, a very authoritarian and repressive and surveillance type of state. I'm referring to George Agamben. I think he was wrong. I wrote about that he was wrong, because from a sociological point of view, analyzing the policies of the different states around the globe, in this book, I tried to make a little bit of analysis of this. I could see lots of changes. And one major change and one major difference in state policies is that the rightist governments, the governments governed by rightist or even extreme right forces, from UK to the United States to Colombia to Brazil and to India, they were the ones that performed more poorly in protecting people from the pandemic. They were negationists for a long time. Brazil is still today a negationist country, and there was not enough protection for the people. In fact, the assumption was that economy first. We have to protect the economy and then protect life for these governments. And in the end, they neither protect the economy nor the people. So one would think that the rightist or extreme right forces, after this failure, this behavior in which they have been proven to be very good at destroying the welfare state, destroying public policies, but they are very incompetent when the task is to build up something, to protect people, to organize social life in a crisis. All these rightist governments collapsed. But then, in policies, one would think that you would lose the next elections, that you would be gone, so to say. That's not the case. Well, there was even Trump, as you know. It was a very difficult and very disturbing change from Trump to Biden. But in other countries, if you look at Modi, if you look at Boris Johnson, looks at Ivan Duque in Colombia, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they go down in the public opinions, but they don't go down that very much. It's really intriguing. Is this the trivialization of death? That death has become statistics? That in a country, 500,000 people are dead, like Brazil, 500,000, and nothing happens. It could be 600,000, 700,000. They're statistics. And these statistics don't mean anything, except they mean a lot for the people that lost their family members during this crisis. And the most disturbing thing is that the virus was and is chaotic, but it's not democratic. If you look at the mortality rates, you can see that the social groups that were most affected in most countries were elderly people, were poor people, impoverished people, Black people in the United States and in Brazil, because they were Black and because they were impoverished or poor, as we usually call them. So there is a kind of a social Darwinism. Are we on the verge of developing a new demographic policy that through pandemics and sanitary crises solve social problems? Get rid of discardable populations that are a burden to social security? Well, I don't know. This is the disturbing aspect of this. So now, in the minutes that I have, in the last 15 minutes of my talk, I'd like to. Where are you going to? What is the future is next decades? Well, the first statement I made, that in fact we are entering a period of intermittent pandemic or recurrent pandemic, has to do with the relationship between this pandemic and the climate change. All the articles that in the meantime have come out about this show that this pandemic shows that this pandemic is different from the previous one in its genealogy, because it has to do with the fact that our human life is 0.01% of the total life of the planet, 0.01%. And in spite of being such a minute portion of the life on the planet, we have the arrogance of destroying nature. So you are destabilizing the cycles, the vital cycles of the wild animals by deforestation, by contamination of rivers, by open pit mining, by all the climate changes that we are witnessing, and all these viruses that are absolutely crucial when they circulate among these animals. When they come to the human beings, they are not protected. So we are entering a period in which we are becoming more and more vulnerable to these transformations. So are we ready to confront that? This idea that seems to be now more obvious than before? Well, it depends on the scenarios. In my most recent book, I defined 3 scenarios that I see emerging on the globe after the acute crisis, the acute phase of the pandemic. The first one is the negationism. It is still prevalent in Brazil, in Colombia, in many countries in Africa, and also in India to a certain extent. Is the idea that this is not a serious thing, and things, the pandemic will go away, and things will come back to normal, and everything will be normal very soon. Well, a recent report from the International Monetary Fund, which is a very interesting report because it makes a kind of an historical analysis of the social and economic consequences after the major pandemics. For instance, the ones in the 19th century. What it says is basically that is after the acute emergency period of the pandemic, a social crisis tends to develop, particularly if the countries are not prepared to change public services, to, for instance, refinance public health. So there will be social unrest that in many countries will become a question of governability. And what they say is that most probably the only weapons to confront this social unrest will be surveillance and repression. And this surveillance and repression will lead, in this case, Agamben is right, in this scenario, a state of exception. What is the future of democracy in that scenario? A very gloomy perspective for democracy. The second scenario is what I call the Gatopardism. Gatopard, of course, you know, comes from the Lampedusa 1958, the novel, in which, in fact, it's famous by, you know, they say that, you know, something has to change so that nothing changes in reality. I think the European Union is the champion of this model. In the book, I analyze that in a very detailed way because, you know, relating to the editorials of the Financial Times, which I think were very, very good on explaining this Gattopardo type of scenario, we are going to make some changes. Energetic transition, for instance, digital transition, the durability of goods. We are going to probably refinance our health systems, but nothing substantially is going to change in the ways we live, in our consumption habits. Our computers last for 2 years, 3 years. They could last for 20 years. Our cars could last for 30 years. They last for 5 years. So we are in a world of planned obsolescence to make us dependent on the market. So nothing is being addressed on these issues. We are probably in a transition to get rid of the fossil economy. And because we know from the agreements of Paris that we have to leave the unexplored most of the oil that is still being explored in the world. And the levels of the climate change and global warming are very, very drastic and threatening. And things are happening in Europe, for instance, that Europeans with some arrogance are saying, but this should not happen in our continent. If you looked at the news, the television in Germany, when there were huge floods in Germany, the minister said, this is not supposed to happen in Germany. We are used that to happen in Bangladesh and far away, but it's happening here. So I think that the Gattopardo scenario is going to probably avoid a social crisis, because in the short run, the social crisis will not be as serious as in many other countries or in the first scenario, but it's not going to address the major problem. So I think the third scenario is the scenario that I call civilizatory alternative. I think that this pandemic is telling us, that's the message that I can almost listen from nature. The message is this: please, since the 17th century, you believe that nature belongs to you. Change your mind and think that you belong to nature. This is a major change, because in fact, all of us were trained in the idea, the Cartesian idea, that nature belongs to us, is at our disposal. But now we have to switch, and you don't have to go beyond Europe. In the 17th century, side by side with Descartes, Spinoza was saying that in fact, nature is also the mother earth, that we belong to nature. It was the distinction that Spinoza made between natura naturata, which is the res extensa of Descartes, and the natura naturans. That is to say, the nature that is the vital source of life, human and non-human life. So if this is what the indigenous people, I've been doing much my sociological work in Africa and Latin America, most of the people in these regions believe precisely this, that we belong to nature. If we belong to nature, we have to care about it. So an economy of care has to be developed in this century. Not just human care, but care about nature in general. And that's why I think that, for instance, for the first time, we are witnessing with some credibility something that doesn't fit our Western model of thinking, the rights of nature. They are inscribed in the Equatorian Constitution, and recently in New Zealand, it has promulgated the human rights of a sacred river of the indigenous people in New Zealand, and pouring millions of dollars in this river to restore the cycles, the vital cycles, not just to decontaminate the river, but to restore the margins, all the ecological environment of this river that has been highly polluted by the industry. So human rights of rivers, this is a kind of revolution. But we have in Italy a great constitutionalist, Luigi Ferrajoli, that has precisely defended the idea of a constitution of the earth, which in fact had already been proposed in 1958 by Aldo Leopold. That is to say, we are in a process that we have to change, and for our social science, the responsibility is to think that, for instance, not just that health is not a business, but is a public good. What are the public goods? What should we have as public goods? The relation between the city and countryside. This is very important for geographers. I'm still living in my village. If Boccaccio had not left Florence, we wouldn't have the Decameron. His parents died of the plague. So why do we have this model of thinking that the city is progress and the countryside is the old traditional static world that is past? Why do we have this? While all the statistics shows that the larger the cities, the higher the mortality rate of the pandemic. Why do we protect ourselves in the countryside in order to defend ourselves from the pandemic? Shouldn't we change urban planning and have a different relationship between the city and the country? The countryside has to be urbanized. I mentioned, for instance, the statistics of the report of the OECD that says that 60% of the kids in the world lost forever some part of their learning because of the crisis, because they lived in communities where there was no internet available. Even in Europe, all the studies show that the countryside is not well served by internet services because the countryside doesn't pay from a capitalist point of view to have all the equipment for the internet. So we have to change. And I think the cities have to be downsized. We know, for instance, today, that's another example that I could give you. We have to downsize the commercial centers because the commercial centers are going to be high risk zones because of the confined air in which people can stay for long hours. It's not a stadium, a football stadium. It's a place where people are enclosed for many hours per day. Well, why don't we move from the really incentives to these huge commercial centers and not just to the neighborhood commerce, the small commerce that protected us during the pandemic? So I think that I could mention and go forever because in the book I select some 15 measures that would be the most urgent measures. For instance, food sovereignty by the states that I have analyzed, the question of water. Probably we don't know that in Central America the distribution of water is privatized, as in many other countries. Well, the pandemic crisis, the people didn't have any employment and they couldn't pay the water bill. So the companies closed the taps. There was no water for people. So the states had to intervene and to suspend the cuts so that people should have water to drink and to cook. Well, the companies are now suing the governments because the governments have frustrated the legitimate expectations of profit of these companies because they are there for profit, not for social services. So I think all this should lead us to think what kind of society, even this small world which is Europe today, that feels so well protected, it is not so well protected, and we should really try to address this big issue. But what would be the political will? If our politicians were trained not to think about alternatives, particularly in the last 40 years, and they are very much concerned with the next election cycle, how can they think about this long duration type of transition in which we should embark? That's why I think that universities are going to play a very important role in this pedagogy of the transition to an alternative. That is the only solution if we don't want to fall into a world in which we cannot hug anymore anyone. I have to tell you personally that I hugged someone outside my family for the first time in 1.5 years last week in the book Fair of Lisbon. That is to say, even our senses, our sense of sociability are being diminished by the physical distance, which is not a social distance, but in any case is a deprivation of senses. What is the impact of this in our lives if it is the long duration? What is the impact if, as it is now being said in this country, that masks are there to stay? Particularly in, for instance, my university is obligatory to be with a mask today. From now on, from the academic year is what is the impact of this for social relation, for teachers and students, for people in a state administration office, if everyone has masks? When are they smiling? When they are not, when they are speaking, when they are not. I mean, I think we have to address these issues. Some of them are micro, others are global, but people are a mixture of the global and the micro. So I don't want to disquiet you with bad news. This is not bad news. It's just the need to confront the challenges ahead. And if we are able to confront them, nothing irreversible is there. But if we are not, I think that the life on the planet is not in danger, but human life in the planet may be in danger. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Boaventura. Very impressive with your suggestive and shiny speech. I think that you put different elements to be discussed and to be taken also and take it and move them like forward. Meanwhile, we are waiting for somebody that break the ice, like the Italian say. I would like try to figure out your scenarios that you mentioned. So with the exception of the first scenario that I think that within university perhaps is not that adopted, at least from the majority. How to switch like from the second, what you call the Gattopardo scenario, Tomasi Lampedusa. I think that the Italians knows not just the novel, but also the framework, the approaches, and the attitude. So how to move from the second Gattopardo scenario to the third one, the one of the alternative, Otro Mundo Possible, as we said many years ago. So what is your like suggestion in this framework? What do you think?
Well, Salvatore, I think that as Lucien Goldman once said, I mean, the maximum possible consciousness of our time is probably the Gattopardo in the north, that is to say, in the global north. I mean, the global north is the part of the world that has benefited from the destruction of the planet. So we have benefited with our welfare society, with our consumption levels and so on. So we are not very well prepared to confront the alternative, even though I think that the intellectual basis and knowledge for that alternative is with us in part. But there is no political will, even no social will. Where do I see it? Among the young people, among the youth. I mean, you know, it's really very strange almost if it's a young person like Greta Thunberg moves the youth of Europe on the idea that the world is about to end. That is to say, 40 years ago, the alternative would be, well, the capitalism is about to end, and another society, another world is possible. Well, Greta doesn't believe another world is possible. He said, well, probably the world is gone if we continue this day. You see, the type of a framework of analysis is very strange and very intriguing, because it seems to these youth, the young people, is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, of this current society. Should be. I mean, for us, for the older generations, but you know, the end of the world is a maximal perspective. So I think the young people are really pleading for the alternative. They are the ones that are already trying, whenever possible, with alternatives to consumption. We see that everywhere. And I think that will be growing in the next decades, new forms of sociability. I have to tell you also that this pandemic brought some interesting and positive things, not just negative things. For instance, we know that in the global north, a young couple, you know, 40 years of age, when they have children, one or two children, and these are between 2 and 6 years old children, they spend per day with their children, this couple, on average, 20 minutes a day in our global north, highly developed societies. Well, the pandemic came, and many of these people could resort to telework. So they are spending more time with the family. And this is changing social relations, parents and children also. It was a positive thing. The negative thing was the increased rise of gender and domestic violence. Because of the confinement, the woman was 24 hours when they could, together with the partner, which is also the aggressor. And in that case, of course, was very negative. All the countries, the statistics that I present, the first country that showed a dramatic increase of gender violence was France, was not a country in Africa or in Latin America, was France. So I think that after the confinement, so I think the lockdown, so I think that we are in Europe, the political will, the maximum possible consciousness seems to be the gatto pardo, even though there are ecological movements that are there, and the youth that is claiming for alternative. On the south, well, it's a mixed picture, because the people have already lived with the bad consequences of the climate change. Look at what the United Nations are predicting, that this century is the century of the environment refugees, because you know much better than I do that human life is possible within a small range of temperatures, low and high temperature, very limited, and is shrinking. So more and more people are going to be environment refugees. So all this situation is very much addressed, and I would say that the countries in the global south are really ready for a change. For instance, 150 countries pleaded for the licensing of patents, so that, for example, Uganda has very good capacities, laboratories, to produce the vaccines, not to speak of South Africa and India, but they asked for the licensing. And the European Union said no, basically because of Germany. Germany, because many of the patents belong to German companies, they said no, the patents are here to stay. Well, with very dramatic consequences in the future. So I think that even though I think that the alternative, the third scenario, is the only possible to guarantee in the long run, I think that we'll probably have to undergo other crises before the dominant powers, and probably I think the coming crisis will be the intensification of the Cold War between China and the United States, in which Europe, for the first time in history, doesn't play any role, is trying to escape here and there, making this with Russia and China and the United States, etc. But I don't know how sustainable this policy is for Europe. Europe is a secondary element in the power structure of the Cold War for the first time. So, and it's not after the Second World War, which was another process. So I don't know. I think that we have to move ahead, but it will be more. That's why I think that citizenship, social movements, organizations, and universities, that's why the universities today are under attack, Salvatore. I think that universities are the only place in which we can still have, with all the limitations that we know, free, critical, plural, and independent knowledge. And the conservative powers, particularly, they don't like this. They prefer not the reports of our university professors, but probably from consultancy firms that produce the knowledge that they need and want, and not free, independent, plural, and critical knowledge.
Thank you so much, Professor Boaventura De Sousa Santos. A very complete and clear answer. So it seems that somebody is coming in the chat, and I would firstly give the floor to Professor Massimo De Marchi. He can directly speak by the microphone.
Thanks, Professor Boaventura De Sousa Santos. Happy to meet you after a long exchange of mail. We are a geographer. We worked some days about some critical approach to capitalism, change, etc. One question related to the last book of this year about decolonizing university. What are possible direction, path, key element to decolonize university, because I think there is a different situation of different disciplines and universities. For example, there are disciplines working on genome, on fossil fuel, and etc. There is also inside the university some critical approach. How you see this element? How to decolonize university?
Well, Massimo, thank you very much for this question. It's very, very dear to my interest. And because as you and and as a university professor, I'm very much concerned, and I have the kind of privilege of knowing two different worlds of universities: the Portuguese European one and the U.S. University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in the United States, is the pressure of what we call university capitalism is immense. Not only that the public universities are being privatized, that is to say, for instance, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, even though if it is public, is run by private funds. The public funds are 40% of the budget. The rest comes from own sources, that is to say, for the profits that university make in one way or the other, and very much the patents, as you can imagine, right? In nanotechnology, genome, biotechnology, and so on. So every day we see in Wisconsin, we see that everywhere in the United States, closing down departments of humanities, for instance, literature, ethnic studies, and every year and all the time, new departments of nanotechnology, biotechnology, new buildings, new investments, even private companies building buildings within the public universities, which is the promiscuity between the public and the private that in Europe it's not so prevalent. So I hope that the United States is not the one that is leading the world in this field. But I'm really very much concerned about these developments, because when I look at even the European fund researchers, for instance, I had some recent years ago a very large European Research Council grant to conduct a European-wide and, in fact, global research project. Well, I have been paying attention to the struggles in the budget of the European Union. And one thing that I want to do is to eliminate social sciences as a kind of an independent item for public funding for research. They say that only funds available should be innovation, that is to say, industrial innovation. So geography, for instance, well, geography is an hybrid, so to say, because physical, social, etc. But if it is really committed to capitalist industrial innovation, fine, you have funds. But if you want to study things that have nothing to do with innovation, industrial innovation, there are no funds available for that. The European Parliament stopped that measure that was coming from the European Commission, and we still have an independent funding item for social sciences. But for how long? So I think that even though the need for decolonizing is tremendous, what we are witnessing is a kind of opposite process, recolonizing, not decolonizing. So what is decolonizing? Massimo, I have seen in this book I wrote on decolonizing the university, the decolonization of the university has to be different in the global south and global north. Even though the universities that were created in the global south were modeled upon the universities of Europe, of the United States. And in fact, in the colonial period, all the universities that Spain and then the British also created around in the colonies were very much similar to the one in the metropolis. They were not very different. They taught the same things. So we have to decolonize. Well, how do we do that? We have started by the students' reaction. I mean, the students in many countries, the United Kingdom is the most advanced one in this report, in this respect, because the students react. First was the access to the university. not just because of class, but because of gender and because of color of skin and so on. So the question of affirmative action that had taken place in the United States. That was the first measure. Then they invested against the curriculum because many of the students were coming from the British Empire. And the heroes of the history at Cambridge or Oxford were the villains that massacred their people in the colonies. And they could not stand that. There were mental health even problems for these students because they couldn't study those books. So they are now revising. I belong to a commission and in the United Kingdom now to revise the curriculum according to these new revisions. So we are in another phase, which is not to eliminate knowledge, is to add up knowledge. Why is it necessary? Massimo, the reason is an Hegelian reason that we know very well, because the model of our education at university is the Hegelian model. You see, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, as Hegel says. That is to say, after the social struggles, after we have the struggles decided, there is a moment of quietness that allows for knowledge to develop. And our paradigm is knowledge after the struggle. The problem is that after the struggle, only the knowledge of the winners survives, of the historical winners. Where are the knowledges of the vanquished, of the losers of history, the colonized people, the enslaved people, the discriminated against people? They are not there. They are not even in our archives. So we are bound to teach the knowledge of the winners of history, not the knowledge of the losers. And the knowledge exists. And that's why in my last 10 years, I've been investing so much in epistemology, and I'm glad to tell you if you speak fluently English, but you know, it's now available in English, all these two books on the epistemology of the South and the end of cognitive
Epistemología del Sur, podemos.
Okay, so I think that there you can see that I see our task is basically epistemological, methodological, and pedagogical. And we have to go one by one because the enemies of decolonization are not just forces outside the university, are university forces. Our colleagues, many of our colleagues are very comfortable to the current status quo, and they don't want to change. And sometimes they are in positions of power. So we have to conduct a very sustained struggle. It's that goes from access, which is easier. Bringing down status is very easy also in a sense, but bringing down curriculum and replacing it by another one, these are the commissions that are taking place. Another one is University of Connecticut in the United States, is taking that very serious. How we are going to present both sides of history. For instance, if you are taking in geography, urban planning, for instance, I did my first sociological work in a squatter settlement in Rio de Janeiro. Well, how can I see urban planning from the perspective of the favela, of the squatter settlement? Is a different perspective. And I think that we have to see from the other side, which I call the colonial side, because there is this abyssal line. And if you change this, what I call the epistemology of the South. Knowledge is born in struggle against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And if you look at that, the future seems more credible because all my work with indigenous people, I didn't need Spinoza. I knew Spinoza because I had studied Spinoza in philosophy, but I didn't know. I didn't need him because working with the sage of the indigenous people and peasants in Latin America, they could tell me, yes, you know, the nature is Mother Earth. We belong. We can hunt. We can kill animals, but not for pleasure or to be rich, just to eat. We need probably to kill them to eat, but just that. And if you do that, you don't mass destroy nature. So that's their idea of buen vivir or harmony with nature. So they are telling us, and quite frankly, 70%, 75% of biodiversity in the world is in the territories owned by the indigenous people. So they have been the guardians of biodiversity. All of that is known, but is not part of our curriculum. We have to bring it in, Massimo. That would be probably the first step that our students and the younger faculty would appreciate our move.
Thank you so much, Professor Boaventura. Several questions came, but we would have like an extra time to talk to you for hours and hours. We cannot. So I'm going to also, because some of them, to some of them you already answered. So I would aggregate some questions, and I'm going to list them all now. So first of all, Vania Santi says, thanks to Professor De Santos for a very interesting speech. The role of state in safeguarding the security of common goods, earth, environment, so on, is constantly being weakened, as you hinted. Do you see any possible counter tendency to this, any of the scenario you depicted? Or who will be taking that role if not the state? First question. The second question is again related to the role of university. Alberto says a university as public institution can play a crucial role in knowledge and making and sharing. What is the actual role of the university and what they can address, but it is connected to the Massimo questions. And Margherita, again, related to the same Alberto's issue, regarding the role of human and social sciences in coping not only with negativism, but also with gatopardism in both climate and pandemic crises, that as you well showed, are interconnected. The second relates to the risk of essentializing the role of nature in the third scenario that you presented. Then, I know there are a lot, Professor Mauro Varotto from the section of geography here in Padova asked a question about the territorialities of the future. The hypothesis of recurring pandemic could lead us to new medieval territorialities with gated monastic communities increasingly widespread at different scale, local, regional, and national, and an inversion of globalization processes. A desirable prospect also in the direction of contrasting climate change. Can global threats be best fought with global or local responses? It's very geographical. And the last one is from Ginevra Pierucci. I would like to thank the professor because me, together with many other scholars, we are studying wilderness, both from the point of view of physical geography and from that of human and social geography. And just yesterday, in a session dedicated to the wilderness dynamic, we asked ourselves what is the urgency that today leads us to reflect and to research on these issues. I thank you because your speech offers a global interpretation on the relationship between vulnerability and wilderness that allows us to understand the importance of our research questions and the impact that this research should aim to have. So, Viviana Ferrario, another professor from geography, thanks for this so inspiring speech. I am particularly struck by the disurbanist vision that you propose, the downsized cities. This utopia periodically re-emerged during the crisis. Russian disurbanists after the First World War, for example, Sorokin and Zimmerman. Nevertheless, in European debate, this position is generally interpreted as reactionary. The lefts have generally sustained instead the urban concentration. Certainly, I cannot imagine you as reactionary people, so probably something changed. What has changed and how this urbanist utopia has to do with food and food security and agricultural policies in Europe and other parts of the world? So please, I know there is a lot of things to face. We have no more than 8 minutes, I would say, to conclude. Thanks, Boa, for understanding.
Thank you, everyone. I mean, they are fabulous questions. I'm very pleased. Thank you very much. But yes, we don't have time. And as you can see, I had to compress. Usually my lectures are for an hour or 45 minutes, but my assignment was 30 minutes, and I usually like to be punctual and comply with the time that is assigned to me. Well, I think that the questions, some of them I had answered, so I'm not going to replay the questions of the university and so on, but because I think they are very, very crucial, and we can discuss it at a different time. I think the role of the state is really intriguing, because it's clear that the role of state was predominant everywhere under this crisis, because the markets disappeared, as a matter of fact. If in my study, I analyzed, for instance, the private education systems in many countries. They even refused to accept COVID patients. They didn't want to be involved in the COVID pandemic. And when they were forced by the governments, they asked such a high price for involvement because of the insurance concerns that it was really unfeasible. So I think the idea of public health as one measure that is now coming to the state. We don't have an alternative agency or governing body or global government for that. For instance, another alternative would be to strengthen the World Health Organization. There have been plans for a while, because some people that say that the World Health Organization is really colonized by big pharma and by the global North countries. Well, you saw that Trump decided to abandon the World Health Organization because it was really being colonized by China. So much contestation that do not allow for global institution to come, because it's a global crisis. We should have a global policy, the health policy now. The vaccines were part of it. In fact, the COVAX was an initiative to globalize vaccination without, in fact, questioning the patents too much, but lowering the prices. But, you know, the companies are in the stock markets. They are not concerned about public health. I mean, they are really concerned about their value in the stock market. And if they diminish the price, then the stock markets go down and the CEOs are dismissed. So they don't want to take those risks. So the contradictions are very much there. And I think that in Europe, because in Europe, I think the Gato Pardo is very well consolidated. All these plans for resilience and recuperation, recovery that are being everywhere in Europe, because it's a European-wide, they signal really a combination between private and public investment. And in fact, it was the first time that we have a kind of a mutualization of debt in the European Union. We didn't have that in 2011, which was a disaster for Portugal, I think for Italy, for Spain, for Greece. Now there is some kind of mutualization of debt, and the central bank is more active in preventing a social crisis. I mean, they have learned something there, but no more than that. So I think that there will be more investment for public health. But for instance, it's interesting. They want not to compete with private markets in health, because, you know, the private market of health has so many lobbyists in Brussels now, that the maximum that they can tolerate is that you may refinance the public system, but in no way put in danger the private business of health. And so you cannot, for instance, valorize the careers in the public system, so that physicians in the public systems win much more money, so that they don't have to have jobs in the private sector. So these are the kinds of problems that we are facing now in Europe. The state is being a contested terrain. I mean, in the United States, you see that very clearly, because you have a federal state and also the states of the Union. So I think it will be a big problem. The second issue here, a very interesting one, is the one on territorialities. You know, Mauro, that even some of the super rich of the world try to build space paradises, because if the planet, the Earth is being contaminated, they are already trying to develop space sites where they can stay in safety. For instance, one of the most expensive investments in the US now is the investment in bunkers. The bunkers that were built, against a possible nuclear war are now a profit-making type of business for very rich people that are building bunkers where they can survive the next pandemic crisis. Because yes, they are very much sure that a next crisis is coming and they don't want to die. So these territorialities could be, in fact, closed condominiums of the future, feudal territories, while outside the people are, suffering and being, destroyed by the recurrent pandemics. This is a scenario. This is the result of the negationism scenario. Is the worst scenario. I think that there are countervailing movements here. And I think that this connects with the last question here on desurbanization. Well, I don't use that term because I think what we are working on is alternative urbanizations otherwise. And it is true that the process was initially a reactionary process because you were at a different stage. Progress was large cities. But it was in the United States that the tension between the large city and the suburbs in the United States were not the peripheral squatter settlements of Latin America, of Mumbai. They were the rich suburbs where people were trying to escape crime rates and unrest and so on. So these tensions have been there all the time. Now you see that, cities like Mexico City or Sao Paulo or Mumbai are unlivable. And because of the public transportation in a pandemic. The public transportation in Mexico City were by far the largest sources of contamination because of physical proximity and for the reasons that you can imagine. So what we are discussing, in fact, at my center here at University of Coimbra, we have a very large European-wide project on alternative urbanities. So in which, in fact, we are trying to develop centralities so that the cities, for instance, one of the things is that zoning, as you know, no? That, you have residential areas, you have commercial areas. In the future, we are going to have more proximity between residential and, the commercial areas of our offices areas and so on, so that people do not have to travel. We are developing, for instance, the urban agriculture. Many central parks are becoming also agricultural fields in many cities. So the cities are being ruralized and the countryside is being urbanized, so to say. So I think the positive side. I think that you are right. Probably there is too much inertia, and the real estate investments are still dictating urban development. But I think that we have to go from there. Well, I don't have much more time. No. I think that something that was related to the global local would be fascinating because the pandemic occurs globally and locally. And therefore should be a lesson that will be another occasion. Thank you very much.